Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 1st of May of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Kherson direction. During the previous 24 and 48 hours, we discovered and spotted certain Russian activity on the direction. Mainly the Russians were bombing the towns and the villages of Ukraine along Dnipro River, as using the different types of weapons, including Kalmur missiles, including different types of FAP, including artillery as well. I'll remind you that just a few days ago, the Syrsky, the head of Ukraine army, stated that Ukrainians, as a result of some special operation, established complete control over this island. This is the island the Ukrainians captured. This is the Nestriga Island. And now, after a few days after that statement, we see a Russian activity. After the statement of Ukrainian head of army, the Russians reported that there are no Ukrainians there, that all those updates was just speculations or something like this. But now we see that most likely the Russians decided just to be on the safe side, and the Russians start bombing and attacking the possible concentration of Ukrainian forces along Dnipro River in the towns like Izomys and Velyka. So most likely there are Ukrainians, and most likely the Ukrainians during the next days or weeks or months are planning to establish complete control over every single island that located, let's say, closer to the Ukrainian bank of the river than, let's say, to the Russian bank of the river. And as I understand, maybe the Ukrainians are planning to do something as they used to, doing in the area of Krynki. So they want to get as close as possible and then to start some landing operation from the Ukrainian side, let's say in the towns like Rybalchye or Vinogradne or Zaporizhzhia or Novokalynove or something like this. And most likely that situation among these islands was the reason why the Russians attacked Odesa during the previous 48 hours. According to information we have, as a result of another strike, the Russians destroyed the headquarters of the group of forces south, including the, head commanders and officers of that area. The Russians were using different types of weapons. This is, for example, the picture of the result of another strike conducted by the Russian forces. And once again, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation confirmed that the headquarters of the operational command south of the forces was hit in Odesa. If you remember, yesterday we talked about the different pictures and of cluster rounds attacks and so on. So most likely those attacks in Odesa also were connected not just with the situation in Crimea, but with possible Ukraine attempts to capture and to seize the control over the islands along Dnipro River. Now we're moving to Zaporizhzhia direction, to Ocheretyne. If you remember, during the previous few days, the Russians published another video of assault operation on the Russian flag in the northern part of the village. But after that, we haven't received even a single update whether the Russians managed to establish complete control and to force the Ukrainians to fall back or not. So now we see that the Russians are using waves tactics of attack. Every single attack the Russians conduct, every 2 weeks. So most likely during the next few days or a week, we're going to see some pause in the direction, and then the Russians will restore everything from the beginning. And most likely the next attack is going to be the final one. Now we are moving to Velyka Novosilka direction. We have significant number of updates. The Russians continue bombing and attacking this territory. We have few cases of very successful counter-artillery duels. On this video we can see the Ukrainian tank along the river in this area, and the Russians discovered the tank that was attacking the Russians from hidden positions, and as a result of Lancet strike, that tank was damaged and destroyed. Also we have some videos of how the Russians were bombing the Ukrainian forces in the vicinity of Starozhovo, Blagodatne. The Russians were bombing the main supply roads that were moving further to the south in direction of Makarovka and Staromayorsk. Staromayorsk was also under very heavy fire. The Russians were using Kalmur missiles. So as you can see, the most important that the Russians have significant rich types of weapon, different types of weapon they're using on the direction. They have Kalmur missiles, Lancet strikes, FAPs, artillery, cluster aviation bombs. They have infantry, armored personnel carriers, tanks, infantry. They have everything they need, and this is the most important evidence that most likely the Russians are planning to start a full-scale offensive operation in direction of Velyka Novosilka in the very near future. Furthermore, we got some updates from the southern part as well. The Ukrainian sources published the video of how they were bombing the Russian forces in the area. This is the moment when the Ukrainians were bombing the Russian forces inside of the farms, which confirms the Russian control over the territory. The Ukrainians were bombing in this area. We have adjusted map based on that. Currently, we don't know for sure what exactly is happening with this part of the southern Ocheretyne, but most likely this part is also already in the Russian control. But as I understand, if let's say the Ukrainians were bombing these farms, this let's say video confirms that the next Russian step is the beginning of the assault process, storming of the village itself, because now the Russians have bypassed the farms area and now the residential area has begun. So this is the situation in the area, and the Russians of course will continue their offensive further. We continue receiving different updates from Prichistovka. For example, on this video we can see how Russians damaged and destroyed with FPV drone another Ukrainian personnel carrier that was moving between the fields, and that attack wasn't the first attack in a row. If we increase the numbers of this since the beginning of April, we can see, let's say, a very big and very huge concentration of Russian fire in this area, and we see complete absence of Ukrainian counterattacks with FPV or artillery, let's say, on the Russian positions. And if we discuss just these geolocations, we can make 100% conclusion that most likely Prichistovka is going to be attacked by the Russians in the very, very near future. Now we are moving further to Ugledar direction. We have also interesting detail from the territory. The Russians start spreading the letters to Ukrainian soldiers inside of the town, suggesting them to surrender. They're providing in these letters some kind of instruction how to do this safely, and according to the Russians, every single week around 20 soldiers surrenders on this direction. Now we are moving to Novokalynove. Probably one of the most important updates are coming from this territory. The Russian sources reported that as a result of offensive operation, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the village by the name of Paraskoviivka. If you remember, during the previous few days we haven't received almost anything from this area, but we were saying that most likely the Russians decided to launch some operational pause in the direction. But today we got two updates. First update was how the Russians were conducting artillery preparation, and most likely after that artillery preparation, the Russians launched an expected attack and cleared the territory, let's say, as a result of one strike. For now, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation still hasn't, let's say, confirmed this piece of information, so we need to wait more. Maybe the Russians are clearing the area, maybe the Russians are trying to, let's say, repel Ukraine counterattacks, but most likely the Ukrainians will not even counterattack the Russians, because there is a water barrier and the bridge, let's say, on the northwestern outskirts of Paraskoviivka was already destroyed. So basically this part of Paraskoviivka is cut off from Konstantinovka itself. So, but anyway, this is significant progress for the Russians, because now they can bring closer to Konstantinovka the Russian electronic warfare equipment, and now the Russians can establish complete FPV drone and mortar control over the eastern part of Konstantinovka, which will reduce the Ukrainian possibilities, and the most important, reduce the possibilities of 79th Air Assault Brigade. Furthermore, by taking Paraskoviivka under control, most likely during the next few weeks, the Russians mainly will concentrate on seizing control over these fields between Paraskoviivka itself, Pobeda, and Novokalynove, because now the Ukrainians obviously will have significant problems to supply and support this area, and it's better and easier for them to safer and more and logically for them to evacuate this territory and evacuate soldiers from this area further to the west. So this is the progress, and this is the situation on Novokalynove, Konstantinovka directions. Now we are moving to Krasnohorivka. The Russian forces continue bombing the central part of the stronghold with significant number of artillery forces and aviations. So if you remember the latest update we have from the direction is that the Russians captured the gas station almost in the central part, and now the Russians probably are trying to clear the area further to the north with the purpose to allow the Russians to move further and to capture the park and to split this area in two as well. Now we are moving to the most important direction, to Ocheretyne area. As you can see, we have a lot of updates, a lot of arrows, lines, areas, and so on. Let's start from the southern part. The Russians continue capturing every day, one by one, more and more trophies of the armed forces of Ukraine, mainly of 47th Mechanized Brigade. Significant number of Bradleys were evacuated from the area and sent to Moscow, to the parade, to the Victory Day. And the thing is that, according to information we have just received before we start making the video, the Ukrainians 47th Brigade was completely defeated, lost significant number of Abrams and Bradleys vehicles, and the Ukrainians currently think how to replace them with somebody else. So this is the situation, and the most important thing from the video is that, as you can see, the Ukrainians are using Bradleys with a desert, let's say, camouflage, which confirms that these armored vehicles weren't prepared for clashes and for battle with the Russians. So maybe they arrived in Poland maybe 5 days ago, and then they were redeployed to Avdiivka, where they were immediately destroyed because of because they were completely visible for the Russians. So this is the situation. Now let's talk about the situation on the ground. The Russians during the previous 24 hours conducted a series of attacks from Solovyovo towards Sokol. We have geolocations confirming the Russian progress and that the Russians are about to enter Sokol itself. Some sources reported that the Russians have already entered the village. Also, we have updates about the further Russian attempts to attack from Solovyovo to Novopokrovska. As well, the Russians reported that they managed to enter the village, but when talking about geolocations, the Russians are still, let's say, in 1 kilometer from 500 meters till 1 kilometer from the settlements. Now we're moving to Ocheretyne direction, where we got significant number of updates, and the most important update is that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt in the village by the name of Arkhanhelske and to capture, let's say, the southeastern part of the stronghold. This information for now was confirmed just by pro-Russian resource. We haven't received this report, let's say, from the pro-Ukrainian deep state, or we haven't received this report from, let's say, Syriac map, but also from a very reliable source. So, as I understand, the Ukrainians who are currently located in these fortifications, in this defense belt, in this rich network of the trenches, were encircled by the Russians, and the Russians created a cauldron. Because this morning we received report that the Russians captured completely Kherson and the Russians captured completely Novokalynove. Now the Russians, as you can see, entered, let's say, Arkhanhelske itself, and the Ukrainians from now on are no longer available to evacuate using the roads because they basically would be destroyed. We don't know for sure the exact number of Ukrainians who are located in these trenches, but probably 200-300 of soldiers were encircled or something like this. And now we understand that the Russians will capture the stronghold by these two attacks, by these two directions. The Russians will clear the Arkhanhelske itself until they reach the water barriers, and then the Russians will move further. And the question is, where exactly the Russians are going to move further. Now the Russians are just bombing and pummeling the Arkhanhelske itself with multiple launch rocket systems. It's some kind of artillery preparation, and very likely, and there are very high chances that by tomorrow morning of the local time, the Russian sources will start confirming complete control over the village as well. But the most important updates are coming from the area of Novokalynove, and the reports we received from the pro-Ukrainian mappers deep state. According to them, the Russians managed to, let's say, split defense belt between Novokalynove and Arkhanhelske, and to, let's say, digging deeper between in the past one defense belt, and now it's with just two defense belts, separate defense belts. And of course, the Russians are going from this direction, try to move in direction of Kalynova, and this is very dangerous for the Ukrainians and very important for the Russians, because if the Russians are able to bypass these Ukrainian defense belts and to enter Novokalynove itself, that located to the north of Arkhanhelske and to the north of Novokalynove, this is going to be another step of disaster for the armed forces of Ukraine that can lead to complete collapse, not just of this operational direction, but of entire tactical direction, Donetsk, New York agglomeration. And most likely this is exactly what the Russians are planning to do the next days. Now we are moving further to Chasiv Yar direction, where we also got significant number of updates. The Russians continue clearing operation in Stupki-Golubkovsky, this forest. We haven't received any geolocations confirming the Russian presence, just reports from the sources on the ground. The Ukrainians try to, let's say, to stabilize the situation by sending additional armored vehicles on the direction, but most of vehicles that arrives in this area destroyed by the Russians. Chasiv Yar, lots of very interesting updates, and the most important is that the Russians have already entered the northeastern and the eastern part of the stronghold once again. We have two videos confirming this. For example, on this part of the video, we can see the moment when the Ukrainians were bombing the Russian forces. This, for example, on this video, we can see the explosion in this area, which confirms that Ukrainians were bombing the edge Russian forces. And on the second episode, this one, we can see the Ukraine FPV drone was FPV droning the Russians inside of these garages. So the Russians entered this territory as well. So currently, based on these two episodes of one video, we can make a conclusion that the Russians are trying to enter this part of Chasiv Yar, and the Russians are trying to enter into this part of Chasiv Yar. So the Russians on the most edge positions, but they're trying to enter. And of course, when talking about the global Russian scope, currently the most important thing for the Russians is to establish complete control over this part of Chasiv Yar. This is the vital question for them. This is decisive question for the Russians, because if the Russians are able to do this, then they will be able to create a window for further offensive operation to Kalynova from the south, because the Russians need to get, as we discussed in the previous videos, this part of Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal, so the area where they can cross the canal without any problems, without any water barriers. Furthermore, as we discussed, the same thing the Russians are trying to do to the south of Chasiv Yar, in this area to the west of Ivanovska. They need to establish control over this ground part of Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal, and of course the Russians wants to do the same in this area. There is a third area where canal goes, let's say, above the surface. This is it. And when talking about this area, the Russians also during the previous 24 hours conducted a series of attacks with significant number of armored vehicles and tanks. Most of the abandoned armored vehicles were destroyed by the Russians. Most likely the Russians managed to restore control over the territories they lost during the previous Ukrainian counterattacks like this one. But now we understand the main Russian goal, to reach this part of canal as well. The control over these three, let's say, areas, these three parts of canal that located above the surface will allow the Russians in the future to attack Chasiv Yar from three directions: from the northern direction, from the central direction, and of course from the southern direction. So this is the vital question for the Russian and for the Russians for further offensive to Chasiv Yar, and of course the same story for the Ukrainians. It's important for the Ukrainians to control this territory, regarding no matter the losses and regarding everything. Klishchiivka. Right before we start making the video, the Ukrainian sources reported that the Russian sources reported that Ukrainians started abandoning their positions from Klishchiivka towards Canal, because they need every single soldier they have just to hold Canal itself and not to allow the Russians to get on the Ukrainian side of Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal. For these purposes, they need to have everybody. They need to have everybody inside of Chasiv Yar. So that's why the Chasiv Yar is overpopulated, over-concentrated by the Ukrainians, and of course the Russians use the situation, and that's why the Russians are bombing and let's say pummeling Chasiv Yar heavily. The Ukrainians suffer significant number of losses. We have the reports of the Ministry of Defense, but for now no ground operation, just small attempts to attack, and that's it. Sever's direction, the Russians continue bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces inside of the Sporna. We got another video of total flamethrower system work. As a result of attacks, the Ukrainians suffered some losses, and this is another episode of another preparation before the full-scale Russian offensive operations towards Sporna itself. Since the beginning of April, we got significant number of geolocations confirming the complete preparation, complete reducing to ruins this entire territory, and we expect when the Russians are going to launch attack, most likely very soon. The same story we start receiving from Verkhnye-Kamyanska. The Russians were bombing the town, the village once again, so the preparation is ongoing, but for now without any ground operation. Bilogorovka, no changes during the previous 24 hours. South in Kupian's directions, the Ukrainians conducted a series of successful counterattacks that allowed them to restore control over the tree lines in the forest in direction of Dibrova. Most likely, the Ukrainians during the next few weeks will try to cut these, let's say, Russian positions and to restore control over them with the purpose to force the Russians to fall as far as possible back from Zheribets River. Just security, let's say, measures, nothing more. The Ukrainians are not going to attack Kreminoe because they don't have forces for this, but to force the Russians to fall back, yes, they do have the forces for these purposes. And now we're moving to Kislovka, and we have small, let's say, progress from the Russian side, confirmed by different mappers, but we haven't received even a single geolocation confirming additional Russian, let's say, movements. And when talking about the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, they also reported that almost there is no, let's say, progress and no activity on this direction at all. So it's very difficult to understand understand what exactly is happening there. Northern direction, Kharkiv direction, we got additional updates. The Russians continue hunting the Ukrainian forces along the border and continue clearing operation. The Ukrainian sources are saying that the Russians are about to launch the full-scale offensive operation before the Victory Day, right after the Orthodox Easter. So we'll see. Of course, it's very soon. It's this weekend, and maybe after that we're going to see the full-scale offensive operation of the group of forces by the name of North. Furthermore, the Ukrainian sources published the video of how they attacked the Russian forces with ATACMS. On this video we can see the concentration of Russian soldiers, a significant number of the soldiers that were probably on the polygons making some military exercises. This is it currently. At least it looks like the Russian soldiers, but it might be everything, including like just the ships or something like this, but the Ukrainians are saying that that was the Russians, and then the Ukrainians attacked this polygon with ATACMS, but the Ukrainians haven't provided us the videos confirming that the losses, just the area with a lot of smoke and nothing more. Kyiv, we have additional updates. We have that the first, let's say, F-16s are going to arrive on the territory of Ukraine right after the Orthodox Easter. So next week, probably we're going to see the first F-16s on the territory of Ukraine. The Western countries understand that they need to send as many as possible as for weapon, and very soon, trying to, let's say, to stabilize the situation on Donetsk and probably northern direction. Furthermore, we got report and statement from Poland. Poland has formally submitted a request to the United States regarding the deployment and stationing of the U.S. nuclear weapon. And furthermore, Poland started another military exercises in the vicinity of Kaliningrad. So the situation continues escalating, and of course, something big can happen in the very near future, in the next months. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.